Are you there?
We're here.
Yeah, sir, sorry.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Yeah, sorry for the rant.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah, this is where we are. We are living in extraordinary and dangerous times. Period. All right. So I want to make one announcement and then a few announcements related to the course. But last class, the class that went from 8 to 9:15, for some bizarre reason, and I've never seen it before in my life, the Zoom dropped. It dropped 3 times during the lecture. And I think it was on my end, which was strange to me because I've got a cable modem. I'm not even on Wi-Fi. I'm plugged right into the internet. So I should have a very stable connection. But for some reason, during the last lecture, it dropped. Now, if it happens during this lecture, in the previous times, just give it 5 or 6 seconds and it popped back on. I don't know why, but if this happens, if for some reason I freeze and I disappear, give it 10 seconds. Okay, I should reappear. Don't do anything, don't jump, don't bolt, don't stay. Give me 10 seconds and we'll see what happens. Okay, so if that happens, hang in there. I will probably reappear. Okay, and then of course if it don't, then I'll see you on Thursday. But that happened, it might happen. So if it does happen, don't be surprised. Wait 10 seconds and I should reappear. Okay, we good? All right, a couple of announcements. Definitely finished with the attempt at self-criticism. We've been moving through it, providing specific examples in it to back up some of the deeper ideas we're talking about as we're moving through these introductory lectures. Definitely be through the Antigone, because we're going to, as we get into the actual birth of tragedy, we're going to have an opportunity to talk about specific dynamics in the Antigone that are examples of what Nietzsche's talking about, this heroic perspective, this agon, that sort of stuff. So absolutely read the Antigone, because I will be using it as a kind of source material to illuminate some of the deeper ideas in Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. So the attempt at self-criticism, get that read, and the Antigone, for sure. I will upload the midterm tomorrow. So it'll be on the Canvas page, and we'll talk about it briefly at the beginning of Thursday's lecture. And then also, too, the videos of the lectures should be up on the YouTube channel tomorrow sometime. I'll make an announcement by that on Thursday. And what else? Oh, I'm going to send you an email to remind you, but I'm also going to upload the next outline. We have one more outline of kind of this introductory material before we get to the Birth of Tragedy, and I'm going to upload that tomorrow. And I'll send you an email to let you know that it's there so you can go and get it, okay? So we have probably 3 or 4 more lectures before we begin the attempt at self-criticism, okay? We are going to probably finish this first introductory outline on Thursday. We're going to talk about very generally an introduction to postmodernism as Nietzsche understands it, as Foucault understands it today. And then on Thursday, we're going to talk about the theoretical device Nietzsche and Foucault use to actually critique and dismantle and challenge metaphysical language and metaphysical accounts of human nature and philosophy. And then we'll do a couple lectures on Homer and on tragedy and some kind of fascinating and playful dynamics. And then we read the attempt at self-criticism. So we are exactly where, in fact, we're ahead of schedule. Usually when I teach this course in person, I get so scattered and we get off on tangents that we're usually behind already. But we're right on schedule, maybe even a little ahead of schedule. So we're in great shape. Like I told you the first day, don't panic. This course has a slow up ramp, and then we move quickly into the Birth of Tragedy, into Foucault, into Kafka. So we are exactly where we are. We're even ahead of schedule a little bit, but that's it. And start thinking about the midterm 3rd week of October, okay? Around there. I know it's early, but just that's the zone, okay? Third week, first Tuesday of the fourth week of October. Definitely before Halloween. Probably the third week of October, okay? So we good? All right.
All good.
Where the hell have we been? We started a couple lectures ago identifying Nietzsche's understanding of Greek tragedy, his understanding and even his stylized interpretation of Greek tragedy. We talked about that. And then we came to the next step in the kind of the architecture, and we said, look, Nietzsche's understanding and interpretation of Greek tragedy, and specifically the heroic perspective, what it is that Nietzsche argues that these Greeks knew, and how what they knew led them to live in a certain way, and how that produced heroic people, how that story, that narrative that Nietzsche tells about that, how that brought him into conflict with the emergence of Socratic and Platonic metaphysics. We talked about that, right? And so we had to say, okay, you know, already early in the attempt at self-criticism, we see Nietzsche criticizing heavily the emergence of Socratic and Platonic philosophy, metaphysical philosophy, and even later on, the emergence of New Testament Christianity. In fact, he sees it as a death of tragedy, and he sees it not just as a death of tragedy, but the beginning of a long sickness, a long illness, a long decline in Western culture. And so we had to say a few words about, okay, what is metaphysics? What is it that Nietzsche's actually criticizing in Socratic and Platonic political philosophy and New Testament Christian theology? What is it? And we saw that. Now that brings us to where we are today, right? In the kind of the architecture and the movement of the ideas and how they relate together and the broader story we're going to tell. All right, so Nietzsche's critique of Platonic and Christian metaphysics, right, then brings us to what will become, as Nietzsche's becoming Nietzsche, and what will become for us in the world after Nietzsche, what is loosely called postmodernism, what we can call post-metaphysical philosophy or postmodernism. So now I want to say a few words about how Nietzsche's critique of Platonic philosophy and Christian theology open up this whole idea of postmodernism. Now, to be sure, Nietzsche never uses the word postmodern. Nietzsche didn't use the word. In fact, the word doesn't come into vogue until the 1950s, 1960s, 1980s, right? I mean, the term postmodernism, and especially the way it gets kicked around today, doesn't emerge really until maybe the earliest Heidegger. But as a kind of a word in academia and a word in pop culture, the term doesn't emerge until really the 1960s onward to the present time. But what Nietzsche does in The Birth of Tragedy, what Nietzsche does in the genealogy of morals, for those of you who had 414, we had 414 last semester, in the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche kind of sets in motion what will become, what we will later call postmodernism. And so I think it's really important to say what that is very loosely, right? How does Nietzsche's critique of Platonic and Christian metaphysics, philosophy or theology, how does that prepare the way for who Nietzsche becomes, and how does who Nietzsche becomes, whatever we could call Nietzsche's philosophy, how does that become associated with postmodernism, right? What is that? And so we're going to do that today. And by the way, this is a critical moment because one, it animates the deeper energy behind The Birth of Tragedy already. In The Birth of Tragedy, which is, by the way, Nietzsche's first book. He was published when Nietzsche was 26, if you can imagine, right? Already in this book is the kind of seeds for what will emerge into a more mature Nietzschean philosophy, if you want to call it that, perspective, gaze, perspective, and certainly what will become mobilized in a more congruent way as postmodern political philosophy and literary theory. in the 1960s, in the 1970s, the 1980s, with Foucault and Lyotard, Derrida, Judith Butler, Richard Rorty, the kind of the pantheon of the postmodern heavyweights. So that's what we're going to do today. So Nietzsche's stylized interpretation of Greek tragedy. Nietzsche's stylized interpretation of Greek tragedy and his critique of Platonic, Christian, and Enlightenment metaphysics is simultaneous with, it's caught up with, it's entangled with what is now called postmodernism, okay? Now, I gestured to this a minute ago. Let me just kind of more formally state it. It is important to note and kind of be aware. It is really, it's valuable, it's important, it's a useful thing to be aware of, that now in literally September 2020, after literally 40 years of its emergence and its use, and the way it's become ubiquitous, the term postmodernism is a very protean idea, meaning it has lots of meanings, lots of usages. In fact, each new meaning spawns new meanings, and each new use spawns new usage. So that's what protean means. And postmodernism as an idea, as a term, and then as idea is wildly protean now. In fact, it's fractal, right? If there's some mathematicians out there, postmodernism is fractal. It just opens up and opens up and opens up and opens up and opens up, right? It's fractal, right? And it's just moving outward. And that's both a wonderful thing, in a weird way, that's very postmodern, right? And in another way, it's become so protean and so used and so weirdly used and broadly used and poorly used, dare I say, that in some ways the term means nothing anymore. So postmodern, and I suppose that's a really postmodern thing. I think Nietzsche would love that. I think Foucault would love it. Postmodernism is protean, and because it's so damn protean and fractal, it no longer means anything, which is very playful. There's a very playful element in postmodernity in language. So postmodernism now, as the word is used, is extremely protean and is used in many different ways across many disciplines. For example, it is commonplace to speak about postmodern architecture. There's a whole postmodern genre in architecture. There's postmodern culture. There's postmodern literature. There's postmodern political philosophy. You even hear now the postmodern presidency, right? We're in the postmodern presidency, right? So you see this term postmodern applied as an adjective prefix to all sorts of things: postmodern architecture, the postmodern presidency, postmodern literature, postmodern culture, postmodern political philosophy, right? Postmodern fashion, even. I've seen articles about postmodern fashion, right? And so that's ubiquitous. That's wild. Like what the hell does that mean? And like I said, in many ways, it's almost impossible now to trace all the different ways in which it's meant. Very generally speaking, at a superficial level, it means a breaking of the rules, a challenging of the rules, a challenging of the formal systems of meaning and the rules. So postmodern architecture would mean a kind of architecture that attempts to challenge or defy the traditional rules about what buildings should look like and materials that you should use, right? Architecture that breaks the rules, challenges the norms, undermines typical expectations of what buildings look like and how they're supposed to function. So that, at a superficial level, that's kind of what it's drifting in that way. Again, postmodern fashion or postmodern literature, right? Literary novels, short stories or novels that reject traditional modern narrative norms or styles or expectations. So again, at the very superficial level, postmodern meaning something that breaks laws, challenges standard ways of doing things and why, and explanations about why we do those things and what we think things mean. All right, so it's kind of functioning at that level. Now, for our purposes in this class, in this kind of narrow, kind of postmodern political philosophy sense, I'm going to use it in a specific way, and I'm going to borrow Lyotard, very famous and very punchy, very pithy and very punchy definition of what postmodernism is in a very famous book. I think it was in the 1980s, 1984, I think it was published. Lyotard wrote a book called The Postmodern Condition, very famous, of the postmodern texts, right? He literally called it the postmodern condition. It was in the word was in the title of the book. And Lyotard offered a very punchy, kind of pithy definition of what postmodernism is. And it's going to govern our use. And then I'm going to unpack what he means by that today. And Lyotard, in a very kind of pithy, kind of French postmodern way, smoking his brown cigarettes, said, postmodernism, this is a quote, postmodernism is an extreme incredulity towards meta-narratives, right? And so that was Lyotard's definition of postmodernism. Quote, postmodernism is an extreme incredulity, right, towards meta-narratives. All right. So, and in an early postmodern way, that's uniquely postmodern for being very clumsy. Extreme incredulity towards meta-narratives. What the hell does that mean, right? That's very postmodern. If you read a sentence you can't fucking understand, that's postmodern. so I mean, I'm having fun, of course, right now, but Lyotard described postmodernism as an extreme incredulity towards meta-narratives. All right, and so let me unpack that. Let's unpack that, and in unpacking that, sort of provide the themes that we will use to govern our use of postmodern, both in Nietzsche and as it will show up in Foucault. All right, so packed in that little sentence, postmodernism is an extreme incredulity towards meta-narratives, right? Packed in that fabulous little sentence are two major themes. There are two major themes packed inside that little statement. And those themes are going to govern our use of the term. And we're going to see this in Nietzsche, and we're going to see this in Foucault. So as we're going to use the term and the idea and the concept, postmodernism is driven by two main themes. Postmodernism is driven by two main themes, at least as Nick Dungy wants to use it, right? And again, you're going to go to the literature department and maybe they spin it, right? You're going to go to the philosophy department and, you know, read some stuff on Heidegger. So this is used in lots of ways, but for this course, it's going to be driven by two main themes. First, the first theme is an extreme suspicion about the existence of objective truth, right? And that first theme is right there in the theme itself, right? Lyotard writes, postmodernism is an extreme incredulity towards meta-narratives. And by incredulity, he means disbelief, a kind of a suspicion, a disbelief. To be incredulous about something means that you don't believe it, that you're kind of suspicious about it, that it's hard to believe, it's difficult to believe, it's almost impossible to believe. I'm incredulous about what you just said, right? I'm incredulous, right? Means a supreme suspicion. It means a profound disbelief. And in Lyotard's statement, it's an extreme incredulity about what? About meta-narratives. And meta-narratives is a clumsy word for objective truth, right? When Lyotard says an extreme incredulity towards meta-narratives, what's a meta-narrative? What is a meta-narrative? Platonic philosophy is a meta-narrative. New Testament Christianity is a meta-narrative. The emergence of the normative, social, behavioral, and medical sciences of the Enlightenment is a meta-narrative, right? These are, when you see the word meta-narrative, they are almost always referring to some large philosophical, religious, or scientific system of thought, which in some way or another claims to be attached to or to be connected to and seeking some objective truth, right? So we could substitute in our course, for our purposes, the word meta-narratives for some type of metaphysics, right? So Lyotard's, literally his statement can be translated: postmodernism is an extreme suspicion, is animated by an extreme suspicion, right, about the existence of some type of moral or scientific objective truth, whether that's a moral, philosophical, or religious objective truth, or a scientific objective truth. Postmodernism is animated. It begins, Nietzsche begins in an extraordinary suspicion about the existence of Plato's forms. An extraordinary suspicion about Plato's claim that out there in the cosmos is an objective, timeless, changeless, applying everywhere all the time and to everybody concept of justice, or that there's an objective account of what human nature is, or there's an objective account. Foucault will become famous by becoming very suspicious about the claim that there's an objective account of human nature that can then be normatively and scientifically understood, diagnosed, and then made healthy, right? So the first theme in postmodernism, as we're going to use it, is this extraordinary suspicion, this incredulity, right, about the existence of an objective truth, right? All postmodern theories, literature, and political philosophy, Foucault's postmodern critique of the Enlightenment, Heidegger's emergent postmodern critique of objective-centered subjectivity, all postmodern theories share the general suspicion about the existence of objective truth, and again, equally important for us, and the claim that not only is there an objective truth understood in terms of essential concepts and natures, but the claim that there is an objectively true subject or person, that in the various forms of metaphysical systems of thought, right, that the subject or the person possesses an objectively true essence, whether that be reason in a kind of Kantian or Platonic way, whether it be the possession of a soul in a kind of religious way, or in a nuanced scientific way, reason's capacity to discern natural and biological laws, okay? So all postmodern theories, and as we're going to use the term in this course, the first major animating theme, all postmodern theories share the general suspicion and incredulity toward the existence of some objective truth, Plato's justice, the New Testament Christianity's conception of God, the Enlightenment normative, social, behavioral, medical, scientific claim that there's a true healthy person, a true healthy sexuality. All postmodern theories begin in and they share a general suspicion about the existence of some objective truth. And this is critical both for Nietzsche's critique of tragedy, right, as well as Foucault's critique of the Enlightenment. And they are very suspicious about the claim that the person, you and I, Nick Dungy, you and I individually, what in postmodernity you will call the subject, but what we could call the person, the individual, and the claim that the person, the subject, or the individual possesses an objectively true essence, whether that be conceived as reason in a Platonic or Kantian sense, soul in a kind of Christian sense or Islamic sense, a metaphysical, theological sense in some way, or an Enlightenment scientific sense, right? And by the way, this is important. We were talking about this a little bit last week. Nietzsche and Foucault are going to challenge the idea that there's something objectively true about you and I, that there's not just something objectively true in the sense that we have a common nature, right? But also true that we have unique individualistic essences and meanings and purposes. Nietzsche and Foucault are going to dismantle that metaphysical argument, okay? So we're working on two levels of truth here. When we say that all postmodern theories are suspicious about the truth, we mean it on at least two levels. They're suspicious about truth in the typical way that we think about it, right? Plato's justice, Hobbes's natural rights, the Christian conception of God, the Enlightenment normative science's claim about the healthy mind, the healthy body, the healthy sexuality, the healthy person, right? They are suspicious about the existence of those meta-narratives. And because they are suspicious about those meta-narratives, the truth out there in its various guises and manifestations, they are also suspicious about the claim that there's some objective essence that corresponds to individuality. They are suspicious of the idea that there's an objectively true self, regardless of how that's understood, right? And as we will see, I'm just going to say it now, we're going to unpack this as we go through the course the next 15 weeks. What they're going to argue is, one, they're extremely suspicious of the objective truth out there, and then two, on the second level, they're going to dismiss the idea that there's an objectively true self and argue that the self or the subject or the individual or the person, whatever word you want to use for right now is fine, they're going to argue that the self, rather than being objectively true, is something that is constructed through power and specifically language as a type of power, right? So as Foucault will famously say, as Nietzsche will say, and as Foucault will famously say, really, there is no objectively true self. The self is in fact, right, the subject is both the effect and the vehicle of power. The self, whatever the self is, whatever Nick Danji is, or Christina, or Aaron, or Brian, or Leslie, right, whatever the self is, whatever you think you are, right, despite the fact that you've been led to believe by various metaphysical meta-narratives, right, that there's some objective truth there, right, to you and your personality and your meaning, your value and purpose, right? That, what you think of that and the way you think of that as true is actually itself an effective power, right? And specifically, as we will see on Thursday, a kind of linguistic power. This is what he will mean by nominalism, right? And then this is ultimately what Foucault will say very famously, right? And by the way, when we get into Foucault and Kafka, you feel free to cry, right? But this is what Foucault is going to mean when he says, look, the self is really both the object and the vehicle of power. That's what the self is. It's not something objectively true with objective meaning, objective value, and objective purpose. It's actually something constructed in language, through language, as an exercise of aesthetics and power. And the self is constructed in that language. And then the self, and by the way, the particular self the Enlightenment constructs then goes on to make that self believe that it's objectively true and becomes a vehicle for that power. So that's the first thing. The first theme is that Nietzsche and Foucault, the way they use postmodernism, the first theme is they're extremely suspicious about the existence of truth as God or justice, and they're extremely suspicious about the existence of a true self with a true sense of meaning, value, and purpose. Okay, and in fact, if there is a value in this course, in some sense, if there's a value in this course, it is even if it's only as an intellectual exercise, right? Because we could go 15 weeks and you can leave the course and go, God, fucking Nietzsche's a nut job, Nietzsche's a nut job, holy fuck, holy shit, right? So even if this is just an intellectual exercise, the value of the intellectual exercise is at least to become aware of the possibility that the self is something constructed through language and power and not objectively true. Okay. Now, I want to say something. We're going to see this throughout the course, and we're going to unpack it in various ways. But when Lyotard says postmodernism is an extreme incredulity towards meta-narratives. And then when I had kind of translated that into an extreme suspicion, an extreme disbelief, the term incredulity and then my sort of variant, suspicion or disbelief or questioning in a less useful way, is strategic and purposeful. The term, Lyotard uses the term incredulity on purpose, strategically. And I guess on two levels. One, strategically, as a kind of playful moment that one occupies in the relationships of power opened up by language and meaning. Okay. But also in a more serious way, in a more philosophical way, this incredulity, right? A kind of profound disbelief, a profound suspicion. Lyotard uses that term purposefully, philosophically purpose. It's not an accident. He wasn't just kind of sitting at home smoking his brown cigarette, you know, thinking to himself, well, what's a good word to put in here, you know? It's specific. It wasn't accidental. It's specific. Incredulity, suspicion or disbelief. And so when we use the term suspicion, or when we use the term incredulity, or we use the term disbelief, we do so purposely. All postmodern theories are suspicious. They're just suspicious. They're just incredulous. They just have a kind of robust disbelief, right? A robust disbelief about the existence of a truth, right? Now, why does postmodernism, and I'm just going to give you the answer, and then we're going to talk about it more on Thursday, okay? Why does postmodernism have just a suspicion or just a kind of disbelief about the existence of the truth, right? Right. And by the way, this is kind of odd sounding to us, because if we go back to the pop culture notion, right, of postmodernism, right, the post-truth presidency, or a postmodern culture where there's no more truth, right? If we think about how postmodernism is used in a very ubiquitous and not very useful sense, and in a kind of pop culture sense, right? The post-truth culture, the post-truth presidency, right? It seems that postmodernism is animated by the idea that no truth exists, right? That's when you use it in a pop culture way, you hear that on the news all the time, right? Commentators, talking heads on the news will say, and of course they'll lament this because they think the barbarians are at the gate. They'll lament this and they'll say, well, we're a post-truth culture. There's no more truth. We're a postmodern culture. And what does that mean? That there's no more truth. We're a postmodern culture. There's no God. There's no truth, right?
Professor?
Yes?
Is it because if they say that there is no truth, then
Yep.
that in turn becomes an objective truth, kind of? Like they're
Yep.
very careful about asserting something.
So you're going to make an old man cry, and I'm going to break out the whiskey early tonight just to celebrate, because that's perfect answer, and it's a perfect answer because we've had some of this with Nietzsche in 414, And so there's knowledge that is happening, and there's knowledge that is being remembered, and it's being operationalized. I love you guys so damn much. Yes, perfect. Technically speaking, we'll say more about this on Thursday when we talk about nominalism, the kind of a generalized postmodern theory of what language is and how it operates. Okay, more on that Thursday. But what Christina said is absolutely correct, right? Trust me, I'm going to explain this on Thursday, but let me just put the sentence out in this way, okay? Technically speaking, Nietzsche and Foucault and Lyotard, right, and Derrida, Judith Butler, they have, technically and philosophically, theoretically speaking, they have to be very careful, right? And they have to be very careful because their own theory of language, nominalism, commits them to a position which makes it unable or impossible, or makes it unable for them to make the statement that some objective truth exists, right? Postmoderns have this nominalist account of language. We'll talk about that Thursday, right? And on account of their own theory of language, language is a human invention. It's kind of an assertion of power, more about that. And through that process, realities about names, definitions, meanings, values, and purposes open up, right? If you have a postmodern account of language, if you have a postmodern account of the way words and definitions and meanings and values and purposes are opened up and created and operationalized, right? You are incapable of making a claim that no objective truth exists. You can't make it, right? It's impossible from your own theoretical apparatus. And again, more on that on Thursday, right? But just to put it in the way Christina put it very nicely, the postmoderns are very careful. Nietzsche's very careful. Foucault's very careful, because the last thing the one thing they can't say, given their nominalism, and the last thing they want to be caught saying, and this was Christina's beautiful point, is something kind of superficial, like, well, I know that the truth is that there's no truth, right? The one thing Nietzsche can't say, and the last thing you'll never hear him say it, is, I know there is no truth. The truth is there's no truth. The truth is there's no God. The truth is there's no metaphysical truth. There's no objectivity, right? And as Christina said, their own theoretical apparatus won't allow them to say it, and then two, even saying it leads them to commit what is technically called a logical fallacy, right? And a logical fallacy is making a negative claim about a positive assertion. The truth is there is no truth, right? So Nietzsche is not saying, I know that there is no God. All right, Foucault is not saying, I know. The truth is there is no scientific truth out there, or truth understood as natural phenomenon. They can't say it, and they won't say it, right? So the best that they can do, and which, by the way, is a very useful thing, and in fact, in a weird way, this is very postmodern. The best that they can do is to say, well, I'm very suspicious about the existence of the truth, right? And that's what Lyotard means when he says postmodernism is an extreme incredulity. It's an extreme incredulity. It's an extreme disbelief. It's an extreme suspicion, right? Postmodernism is not claiming that it knows, postmodernism knows that there's no truth. Postmodernism is not saying the truth is there is no truth. Right? It's not saying that. It's absolutely not saying that. And anybody who tells you on CNN or on Fox or in the bar, the person you're chatting up in the bar, the hipster you're chatting up in the bar, anybody that tells you postmodernism says there is no truth, or postmodernism is a non-truth, they're uninformed. They're uninformed, and you should pay the check and leave, because you're wasting your time. Or better yet, make them buy the drinks. So postmodernism is kind of animated by a disbelief, a suspicion, an incredulity towards the truth. And we'll unpack that more on Thursday. We'll really get into that. And again, there's a reason for it, as we've already seen. Their own account of language won't allow them to make that assertion. And two, it would be committing a logical fallacy in technical philosophical terms. So that's the first thing. It's an extreme.
Professor?
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt you. So I'm looking at I forgot the paper.
Yep.
So so you're saying Thursday we're gonna talk about B, postmodernism is animated by this question, or
Nope.
like the five?
No, we're getting there today. On Thursday, we're talking about nominalism, Jennifer, section 4.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, of course. So far today, we've said postmodernism is animated by two major themes. And the first one is a suspicion towards the existence of objective truth. Okay. Now, I want to just play with this a little bit before I get to the second theme, and we kind of call it a day here, because this is both playful and important. It's both playful and important. Okay. And so postmodernism is suspicious about the existence of truth. It is in no position to say factually or in a determinate way that truth exists or doesn't exist. Okay? So you will often, in addition to this idea that it's suspicious about the truth, you will also, throughout the literature of postmodernism, you will often see it described as a kind of gaze, or a kind of stance, or a kind of perspective about the existence of truth, right? And again, I want us to think two things at the same time, kind of playful and deadly serious, right? Nietzsche will talk about a perspective on metaphysics. Postmodernism brings a critical perspective on metaphysics. Postmodernism brings a critical and an agonistic, a confrontational stance towards metaphysics. You will see Foucault, and it was one of his favorite words in his mid-career, right? You will see Foucault talk about the gaze, right? And he means literally, the first way he means it is literally the gaze. Like, what's a gaze? Someone looks at something with a kind of gaze, right? And I'm being kind of dramatic. I hope I won an Oscar for this, right? The gaze, the gaze, like, right? If you look at something with a kind of a gaze, you look at it as a kind of questioning, kind of critically perspective kind of look. It's a gaze. You look on something with a kind of a gaze, which is a kind of different way of viewing, a skeptical or a different or a new way of viewing the gaze, right? So Nietzsche will talk about a kind of perspective one takes. Nietzsche will talk about a kind of stance one takes. Foucault will talk about the gaze that you bring to metaphysical theories, right? And this idea despite my very bad acting in my modern dance interpretation. This is really important because one, it's playful, and two, it's revealing something quite profound. And it's both playful and revealing something quite profound in the sense that we were just talking a few minutes ago. And I just want to try to make that point, and then we'll get to the second major point we got to make today. More on this on Thursday, but Nietzsche and Foucault are going to interpret language. And we've already seen this when we talked a little bit about Nietzsche's conception of the tragic perspective, right? Point 2 or 3 in Nietzsche's conception of the heroic perspective, the tragic perspective, is that language is a human invention, right? Language is a human invention. Words, and the definitions of words and the meanings those words come to have, and the value those words come to possess, and the purposes, human and existential, that those words and values get pressed into the service of. All of that for Nietzsche is is fundamentally a human invention. It's artificial. It's art, from which the word in this term that we classify art, aesthetic. It's art. It's a human invention. Now, the second point, equally important, and again, more about this on Thursday, it's not just a human invention, but because it is a human invention that gives a name to something, that gives a meaning to something, that gives a value to something, that assigns a broader set of purposes to those things, human or otherwise, human, political, moral, scientific, right? Because it is a human invention that assigns a name and a meaning and a value and a purpose, it is simultaneously an assertion of power. So meaning and value and purposes and power are entangled. They're entangled. They're entangled. They assume each other. They imply each other. So meaning and value is simultaneous with power. Now, here's the playful and incredibly serious part about the gaze, about the perspective, about the glance. Ultimately, and we're going to have a lot of fun in next week's lecture when we start talking about the Homeric epics and how that gets stylized into Greek tragedy. In a very primordial way, what this means, and we'll talk about it quickly because we're going to unpack it throughout the whole class. What this means is that in some primordial moment, right, and say, for example, in the moment of the Homeric epics, as we played with a little bit a couple weeks ago, prior to the emergence of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, prior to the actual emergence of the actual epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and prior to the emergence of the Homeric and Greek worldview that emerged from that moment, there was no Greek world. There was no Greek identity. There was no Greek value system, no Greek politics. It didn't exist, right? Whatever we call the Homeric world, the Greek world, Western civilization, it was originally a poem. And not only a poem as a kind of human invention, but also a human invention of meaning. What the fuck does it mean to be Greek? What is the Greek world? What's the territorial reality? What's the conceptual reality? What are the values of the Greek world? What are the religious values of the Greek world? What are the gender values of the Greek world? All of that was invented in 2 epic fucking poems. Pardon my language. Prior to the emergence of that constellation of words and meanings and values and purposes, both conceptual and geographic, all that stuff doesn't exist because it doesn't exist objectively true. It's not objectively true. But because it exists in that way, it's also an assertion of power. It's something constructed and imposed, and it's something constructed and imposed on people of that time and forever. And forever. So in a really primordial and funky and playful way, you and I are one of the last iterations and stylizations of a poem that is simultaneously a human invention and an assertion of what? Power. Your consciousness, your subjectivity, your meaning, purpose, and value, they're all a kind of human invention and an assertion of power. So you're not objectively true. You're real, but you're not objectively true. Okay, so why did I bore you with all of this? To make the point about the playfulness and the seriousness of the postmodern use of the term glance, gaze, perspective, stance. Because if you begin, and this is going to take time to filter in, so just, I know this is dense and I'm losing you, so trust me, I love you guys unconditionally. Trust me, this will happen, but we got to start talking about it now. So what this means, and we've already talked about this in a way, for Nietzsche and Foucault, you and I are always already defined and revealed and open in linguistic relationships of power. Like I said a few minutes ago, for Nietzsche and Foucault, whatever the person is, whatever the subject is, whatever the individual is, whatever the person is, that is something that is constructed in language as an assertion of what? Power. Love you. Beautiful. Hold on. No, stop. We got to finish this. So the subjectivity or the person and meaning and value and purpose and the way all that's located and centered and decentered in something called Nick Dungy or Jennifer or Samantha or Ruth or Brian, that, and as Foucault said, the subject is both the object and the vehicle of power. What that means is that you and I are always already inside language games that also function as relationships of power. And because we're always already revealed inside these processes, there's no way of ever doing what? Getting out. There's nothing outside the language, right? As Derrida famously said in the 60s, and it took people fucking 30 years to figure it out, there's nothing outside the text, Derrida famously said. And he didn't literally mean nothing outside the fucking book, but he meant that meaning and value and purpose is a fucking narrative. It's a text. And that text was a human invention and it was an assertion of power. And it functions by what he called difference. Foucault famously said there's nothing outside of power. He's right. If you understand power as language, as an invention, and an assertion of meaning. Now, what does all this have to do with the glance? So for postmodernism, so one, we know that the postmoderns are in no privileged philosophical or theoretical position to say, oh, guess what? We finally figured out that the truth is that there's no what? Truth. They can't say that. And so the best they can do is be suspicious about it. And in their suspicion, as an act of suspicion, as an act of incredulity, right? You start to occupy a kind of stance inside the language, inside the relationships of power, opened by the meaning and the value. You look at the meta-narratives and the claims that are made in the meta-narratives about truth, about your morality, about your purpose. You start to look at these things with a kind of glance, with a kind of gaze. You assume a kind of perspective inside and about an always already operating and moving and very contingent, by the way, system of words, meanings, definitions, and values and purposes about everything. So postmodernism becomes a kind of stance, a kind of intellectual, a kind of conceptual, and by the way, a material. More on that in just a few minutes. A perspective, a stance, a gaze within what are still operating meta-narratives, metaphysical narratives. So you and I, what meta-narrative are you and I living in?
Postmodern one.
What meta-narrative are we living in?
The liberal
Give me, what term are we using for it?
democracy,
Postmodern.
freedom.
The scientific enlightenment.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. That's right. And by the way, damn it, you guys, you're about to get a degree in what major?
Political science.
Political science, right? So postmodernism is a kind of stance, a gaze, a perspective inside a particular narrative, and in this case, the Enlightenment, normative, social, medical, behavioral sciences that pretend to tell us the truth about what?
Us.
Us, and even the truth about the knowledge that you guys have been doing what? As political scientists.
Been
Yes.
learning.
Acquiring, and then you're going to go out there and what are you going to do?
Use that
Mhm.
knowledge.
You're going to use it to fix families and to fix problems, right? And you're going to say to yourself, all of this is really fucking what for me?
Bullshit.
No, you're not. No, after the class you'll say that.
Good.
It's good.
Oh,
It's good for me. And it's good for who?
everyone. The city.
Everyone else. Beautiful. Okay. More on this later. That was a lot. More on it. But I just wanted to explain the gaze, the glance, the stance, the perspective. Okay. More on that later. Now, the second theme I want to talk about, so we can end this, and then we can go to nominalism on Thursday. Postmodernism is animated by two big themes. One, an extreme suspicion about the existence of an objective truth and an objectively true self. And then two, the second theme is a question, okay? The second theme is a question. And just memorize the question. Okay, this is the closest to a political science-y thing that I'll ever say to you. So I know I'm a good political scientist. Memorize the definition or the question. All right. So and by the way, this second theme, which is actually a question, is really the heart and the energy of postmodernism. All right. Actually, at the end of the day, Nietzsche and Foucault are less concerned about the big question, is God exist, does God not exist? At the end of the day, that's really not what's important for them in a weird way at the end of the day. Because one, they don't know and they can't tell you, right? And two, what really, really animates Nietzsche and Foucault is not the question. The great question, is God true or not true? Is Plato's justice true or not true? Is Kant's categorical imperative moral knowledge true or not true? At the end of the day, that's not the big question, which is kind of seems counterintuitive because postmodernists are all about that. At the end of the day, what is Nietzsche and what is Foucault really obsessed with? And it's this question. Memorize this question. And I wrote it down for you. What are the consequences to our minds, our bodies, and our politics that derive from our belief in and our commitment to some form of metaphysical, moral, normative truth? That's the second theme, and the second theme is a question. And this is what really sets all of postmodernism in motion. This question: what are the consequences. The consequences to what? Our minds, our psychology, our minds, our bodies. How do we conceive of the body? How do we carry the body? What is the body? What are the consequences to our minds, our bodies, and our politics that derive or result from our belief in and commitment to some form of moral or normative truth? That's the question. This is what Nietzsche is obsessed with, and this is what Foucault is obsessed with. And we know quite generally already that for both Nietzsche and Foucault, those consequences to our minds, our bodies, and our politics, are they positive or are they negative?
Negative.
They're negative. They're negative. In fact, they produce self-hatred. They produce life-hating tendencies. They produce a kind of anomie and a kind of a nihilism and a kind of sickness. Right? And this, and for postmodernism, this is the question. Right? And I'm going to actually send you guys my notes, my lecture notes from Political Science 414 on the preface and I think the first essay of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, just so you can read them, you can have them, right? Because this is what Nietzsche's getting at. And as Nietzsche famously wrote in the preface to the Genealogy of Morals, what is the value? And this is a quote. What is the value of our highest values? Right? In metaphysical systems of thought, Platonic philosophy, some type of metaphysical religion, or Enlightenment science, right? In those different systems of thought, what's the value? First of all, what's the dominant value in those different systems of thought? The idea and the claim that what exists? Truth. Some type of moral and normative truth. Right? That's the value of metaphysics. There's some truth out there. It has a moral and normative orientation. And prior to Nietzsche, prior to postmodernism, nobody dared to question the value of the highest values. We just assumed and took for granted and took as true the dominant value of metaphysical narratives, that some truth exists. And not only did we just take it for granted and never question it, but we never even questioned the value of that belief. And hence the second theme. What are the consequences to our minds, our bodies, and our politics that derive from our belief in and our commitment to this idea in its various guises that some moral or normative truth exists? So Nietzsche says later, he'll say in The Birth of Tragedy, he'll say later in the Genealogy of Morals, what is the value of our highest value? What are the consequences to our mind and our bodies and politics of how we conceive who we are metaphysically, what we do metaphysically, and how we value our life and others and other things from a metaphysical point of view. And Nietzsche kind of takes a sledgehammer to it. This is why he becomes important. This is why he sets in motion what later becomes postmodernism. And he says, what if metaphysical systems of moral/health truth were harming us? What if our commitment to a type of moral or normative truth and a belief that there's a true self were the source of our extraordinary nihilism, or our depression, or our self-hatred, or our sickness? What if moral and scientific metaphysics produced nihilism? What if morality were the greatest danger to human well-being? And of course, at a very deep level, this is the theme in both Nietzsche and Foucault. And reciprocally, as we will see, and this is the hardest sell, according to Nietzsche and Foucault, postmodernism is actually, at the end of the day, for what it does, for what it mobilizes, for its gaze and its glance and its stance on the truth. Postmodernism is affirmative and it's joyous. It's affirmative and it's joyous. It seeks to liberate individuals from a kind of self-hatred. It seeks to enable individuals to escape a kind of nihilism and become creative in the giving of their lives meaning, value, and purpose. All right, beautiful people.
Professor, wait, now you confuse me because I thought that before for them it was negative because they produce self-hatred, and then in the end of the day it's affirmative and joyous?
No, postmodernism doesn't produce nihilism. Metaphysics produces nihilism for Nietzsche. Platonic philosophy, Christian theology, Enlightenment science produce nihilism.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, that's an important point.
I was like, what is going on?
Well, look, the question, what the hell is going on? That's always an accurate question.
I was like, you lost me. Okay.
All right, fabulous people. On Thursday, we're going to finish this outline. I'm going to upload the next outline. And by the way, I'll send you an email and give you the title so you can find it. It'll be on Canvas under file. We'll probably have 2 lectures, and then we're into the birth of tragedy.
Thank you, Professor.
Love you guys so damn much.
Thank you, Nick. See you later.
See you, Brian.
Okay, bye now.
Love you guys.
Bye.